This stone is erected to the memory of Elizabeth Shepherd, who was murdered when passing this spot by Charles Rotherham, July 7th, 1817, aged 17 years. This may look like your run-of-the-mill gravestone, but this memorial marks something else entirely. You see, throughout the countryside of the United Kingdom, there are places where death doesn't hide buried beneath the soil, places where death announces itself, dares you to remember its residual stain. When we think of such places, of course, graveyards and cemeteries at once come to mind. And while we disciples of the macabre love some good old creepy consecrated ground brimming with the remains of the dead, I'm not talking about anything so formal or hallowed as a cemetery. In these places, you won't find grand monuments or Gothic flourishes, no elegiac angels or solemn crosses carved to comfort the living. These places are usually only marked by a stone. Simple, solitary, sometimes crude, sometimes barely legible, set into the ground beside a lonely country road, a quiet field, an unassuming hedge, or a bend in the path. These are murder stones. Found almost exclusively in rural Britain, these memorials don't commemorate death, at least not in the ordinary sense we might be used to seeing in cemeteries or churchyards. Their purpose is to mark sites of violence. Most murder stones appear in liminal places, roadside verges, crossroads, the edges of woodland, the boundaries between fields and estates, places that were already considered unstable, in between, neither fully owned nor fully safe. A murder stone didn't just say someone died here. It said something went wrong here. Take the Elizabeth Shepherd stone, for instance. Located on the side of a lonely country road in Nottingham, the stone stands at the site where 17-year-old Elizabeth, Bessie, Shepherd was attacked and murdered in 1817. On July 7th of that year, Bessie was walking the 7 miles home from where she had just secured a domestic service position in Mansfield when she had the misfortune to cross paths with a man named Charles Rotherham. A former soldier in his 30s, Rotherham was several pints deep when he was observed stumbling toward this very spot. Bessie's severely battered body would be found here hours later, several belongings and items of clothes missing from her person. Rotherham was apprehended when he tried to pawn Bessie's shoes. He confessed and took the authorities back to the scene of the crime, where he showed them the hedge stake he had used as the murder weapon. Rotherham found himself swinging from the end of a noose for his crime. But the locals were so outraged by the senseless act of violence that they all chipped in to erect a stone on the site where Bessie had met her untimely end. These simple, haunting stones are material testaments to a deeply rooted cultural belief that things like murder can leave stains behind. In medieval and early modern Britain, as in other places and periods, killing another person wasn't just a crime against the victim. It was a moral rupture, a form of spiritual pollution, a wound that couldn't be closed with the mere burial of a body or the prosecution of a crime. In fact, many cultures of the past held a common belief that bloodshed tainted a place, that blood itself acted as a sort of contaminant that fundamentally altered something in the soil, in the air, in the memory of the land itself. And so that land had to be marked, in remembrance, but also as a warning that something awful happened on this site. Perhaps the most well-known murder stone is the Unknown Sailor Memorial in Hindhead, Surrey. This stone largely owes its fame to Charles Dickens, who made reference to the very real memorial in his novel, Nicholas Nickleby. Situated in a valley ominously named the Devil's Punch Bowl, this stone remembers the 1786 murder of a man known only as the Unknown Sailor. On his way to his ship in Portsmouth, the victim visited a local pub in Thursley, where he met 3 fellow sailors. After an evening of merrymaking, the unnamed sailor footed the bill for the group and left the pub with his new friends. The 3 repaid his generosity by robbing and murdering him, then throwing him into the valley. Fortunately, the 3 murderers would not escape justice for long. Much like Bessie Shepherd's killer, the men were caught trying to pawn the victim's clothes. They were arrested and hanged from a triple gibbet at the site of the murder. The unknown man was buried in Thursley, with a gravestone paid for by the townspeople. But the local mill owner went a step further. He placed a stone in Devil's Punch Bowl itself, with the inscription, quote, "Erected in detestation of a barbarous murder committed here on an unknown sailor on September 24th, 1786, by Edward Lonigan, Michael Casey, and James Marshall, who were all taken the same day and hung in chains near this place." The inscription ends with a grim warning, quote, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. The unknown sailor may have been buried in a churchyard, but his murder stone sits entirely separate from his grave. In fact, most murder stones are found far from churches or consecrated ground, and that in itself is significant. As eerie as they may strike our modern minds, cemeteries and graveyards were historically sites with more positive connotations than you might think. Yes, they were still places of death and burial, but they were also sites of gathering, worship, community, and commemoration. In many ways, they functioned as repositories of collective memory and shared tradition. a physical symbol of communal solidarity and continuity in a world where death is inevitable and life is expected to simply march on. Beneath the headstones that dot the landscape of designated burial grounds, the dead are, at least in theory, at rest, regardless of how or when they met their end. Murder stones denote something else altogether. They don't speak of souls at rest, but of the same moral rupture associated with the transgressive act of murder. These stones warn the unwary passerby that this is a site that has been despoiled by violence and violation. The inscriptions are often chillingly sparse: a name, a date, a blunt statement of what occurred. Many omit the killer entirely. Some mark crimes that were never solved. Others quietly acknowledge miscarriages of justice without saying so outright. Take the Cadoxton Stone, for instance. The only surviving murder stone in Wales, the Cadoxton Memorial remembers Margaret Williams, a 26-year-old unmarried woman in service to a local farmer. The memorial tells us that in 1823, Margaret was found dead, quote, with marks of violence on her person in a ditch on the marsh below this churchyard. And though the stone itself doesn't tell us the perpetrator or circumstances of the crime, contemporary sources provide some important details. According to local records, in 1823, Margaret Williams fell pregnant and identified the father as the son of her employer. When her body was found strangled and face down in a watery marsh, the farmer's son became the prime suspect. Local opinion was decided, but there was simply no evidence to tie the suspect, or any other, to the crime. And so the farmer's son could not be prosecuted. But that didn't stop the locals from having their own say in the matter. As with Bessie, the townspeople banded together to erect a memorial for Margaret, one that makes a fairly pointed insinuation and offers a clear warning. The inscription at the bottom of the stone reads, quote, "Although the savage murderer escaped for a season the detection of man, yet God hath set his mark upon him, either for time or eternity, and the cry of blood will assuredly pursue him to certain and terrible righteous justice." What matters here isn't resolution. It's memory. These stones weren't erected to comfort the living. They were warnings, acts of penance, public acknowledgments that the violence had unsettled more than one life. They reminded passersby that the ground had been marred by something dangerous, and that forgetting would be its own kind of sin. There's something deeply unsettling but kind of cool about that idea, that a place can remember, that trauma can imprint itself onto the geography, that the land itself might bear witness long after human voices have fallen silent. Because murder stones suggest something modern culture is often uncomfortable with. The idea that violence doesn't vanish once the headlines fade. It doesn't end with a verdict. It doesn't always belong neatly in the past. Sometimes it stays exactly where it happened, waiting quietly by the roadside, asking nothing, simply refusing to be erased.